I'm Zoe, and this is my Visualizing Peace presentation. I will be sharing my learning journey with you by going through some of the work I've done for this module. This is an outline of what my presentation is going to cover. So as an introduction, I'll talk about my initial perceptions of peace. First, before being part of this module, my initial perceptions were largely shaped by conventional notions that most people have. I associated peace primarily with the absence of conflict or violence, what we refer to as negative peace, just as being sort of the opposite of war, without really addressing the underlying tensions or structural inequalities that are present in post-conflict societies. I also believe that effective peace-building efforts were predominantly top-down, so orchestrated by governments and international organizations like the UN. This also was linked to my belief that the study of peace was mostly linked to international relations and the realm of politics. So as a psychology student coming into the module, I was quite insecure about my expertise and what I could contribute and if I could engage properly in conversation, because this was something that I thought was very much out of my comfort zone and an area of expertise that I did not know about. And then finally, my visualizations of peace were also somewhat idealistic. So rooted in the idea that once society reached peace or signed a peace agreement, it was sort of this utopia that was now free from conflict. And this was very much a black and white perception of peace and conflict that really overlooked the multifaceted nature of peace-building efforts. So then my interests, so coming to the module psychology student, I've always been interested in the complexities of human behavior and how people navigate and construct stories to deal with complex issues. I've also always had an interest in the criminal justice system and criminal justice reform, especially since I think our current criminal justice system does not achieve what it theoretically is supposed to achieve, and actually reproduces inequalities and is just inherently not peaceful. Also, I have an interest on whose stories are told and whose stories we hear in the narrative, what voices are excluded from the dialogue, and how to make sure that people get a chance to tell their perspectives. And finally, coming into this module, I knew that I wanted to do research and look into things from the places from which I am from, have lived in. I'm from Argentina, but also lived in Peru for a really long time. So I wanted the entries that I put in the museum and the library to reflect this personal history and just include knowledge into the Visualizing Peace project about this area of research. So based on my areas of interest, I chose to focus on peace and justice. These are some of the questions I wanted to look at. For example, how do we conceptualize justice and what justice means for different societies? What is an effective justice mechanism? Effective meaning that its design and implementation fosters sustainable peace without reproducing violence. Then are the goals of peace and justice in opposition or complementary? And the two final questions, justice for who and peace for who? And I think these questions challenge us to critically examine the inclusivity and equity of justice and peace-building efforts, looking at whose voices are heard and whose interests are prioritized in the pursuit of justice and peace. So by addressing these questions, I hope to contribute to an ongoing conversation aimed at reimagining and reshaping our approaches to justice and peace. So going into this, we can talk about the peace versus justice debate. And that basically addresses how post-conflict societies should address human rights abuses after conflict. So should we forgive and forget, or should we prosecute and punish? And there's basically two views to this debate. So peace first, justice later, which basically says that it's more important to resolve direct conflict and stop violence before seeking justice. And this, for example, would involve the use of amnesties, which are extraordinary legal measures that grant perpetrators immunity from prosecution for their crimes and are frequently employed as a negotiation to peace processes, so that to stop perpetrators from committing human rights abuses. And then the second view is no peace without justice, which basically means that peace cannot be achieved with impunity and with letting perpetrators get away with it. And in order to have sustainable peace and to be able to have a more peaceful future, people have to be held accountable for the atrocities they committed. And this involves trials, prosecutions, and truth commissions. However, a lot of times this debate is framed as very black and white, so as peace versus justice. And what I'm going to explore through this presentation is that this is very much a false dichotomy, and that peace and justice in itself are very intertwined, and that you cannot separate one from the other, and that the two goals they're not opposing goals, but complementary goals. So for my learning journey, I will go through my library entries, and I've structured in a way that I think as I go through the entries, they also reflect the evolving of my understanding of peace and justice, and my reflection on the relationship between the two and how to make justice effective so that to promote sustainable peace. So starting with my first entry, Peace versus Justice, the perceived and real contradictions of conflict resolution and human rights. And this article really, the debate that I just discussed between peace and justice takes center stage, so that's why I've put it first. And it just prompts the reflection of whether we should prioritize, what we should prioritize, which is peace over justice or justice over peace. It uses 10 case studies from both Africa and Europe to sort of illustrate the limitations of putting justice over peace. For example, political implications, the limitations of transitional justice processes, and also the effects that intervening institutions like the International Criminal Court have had. For example, the author brings up an example of the governments in Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo who invited the ICC to investigate and prosecute crimes in their own territories, and how this was applauded by the international community, but actually the governments of these countries had alternative political intentions to successfully try to delegitimize and remove their political rivals. Additionally, the article also explores the differing perspectives of human rights versus conflict resolution experts, and that's sort of another way of framing the peace versus justice debate. And overall, what's most important about this reading is that the author urges readers to view peace and justice as mutually reinforcing rather than mutually exclusive concepts. And he suggests that we should do this by expanding our definition of peace beyond merely the absence of violence to encompass notions of social justice, so positive peace, and just encourages a more nuanced understanding of justice itself that goes beyond retribution and prioritizes restoration. Finally, the article also sort of emphasizes the importance of addressing these issues multidisciplinarily. So not human rights versus conflict resolution, but both disciplines working together and using their expertise to bridge the gap to sort of achieve sustainable peace. So as I've reflected on this article, and what I hope this article leads other people to reflect to is their definitions of peace and justice, and to look beyond what the black and white peace versus justice debate might suggest, and also consider how these concepts intersect and influence each other. And so by acknowledging their interconnectedness, we can better navigate the complexities of conflict resolution and reconciliation efforts. So ultimately just working for a more peaceful world. So then I wanted to link this to one of my museum entries that I called Peace at What Cost? The Amnesty Dilemma, and just discusses this issue of whether we should grant amnesties or not. And some of the questions that I wanted readers to reflect on and that I was reflecting on were these. And I wanted to just give a short answer to them in this presentation. So firstly, what does justice mean to you? And so for me, justice encompasses more than just legal retribution. It involves fairness, equity, and the restoration of dignity for all individuals all individuals involved. So it involves not only holding perpetrators accountable for their actions, but also working towards healing and reconciliation for victims. Then how can societies balance the need to pursue accountability for crimes with a desire for reconciliation, and whether these two things are mutually exclusive? Like the peace versus justice debate, I do not think that these two things are mutually exclusive, but rather they should be reinforcing. And once again, they have to be addressed through employing a combination of legal mechanisms such as trials and truth commissions alongside community-based initiatives aimed at promoting dialogue, understanding, and empathy. And then finally, is the relationship between peace and justice as complicated as it seems? And I think that this is a very complicated question to answer because at its core, both justice and peace are fundamental human aspirations rooted in the desire for fairness, harmony, and the resolution of conflicts. So ideally, justice should pave the way for peace, and peace should create conditions for justice to flourish. So in theory, the relationship should not be that complicated, but a lot of times it seems to be. So I haven't really found an answer for this question, but I hope that's something that you can reflect on throughout my presentation. So my second library entry is the phenomenon of enforced disappearances in transitions to peace. And I think what this addresses is the question of what does justice look like and what might justice entail for post-conflict societies. And one of the aspects of having justice in a post-conflict society, which is addressing human rights abuses like enforced disappearances. So this article delves into this complex issue and its implications in transitional contexts. The author sheds light on the global prevalence of enforced disappearances, spanning from instances resulting from ethnic cleansing and war crimes to those stemming from forced migrations. And she underscores how enforced disappearances represent a continuous violation of fundamental human rights that perpetuates anguish and ambiguity among post-conflict societies, especially for family members of those who are disappeared. So to this, as a reaction to this, the author emphasizes the pivotal role of states in addressing disappearances through a holistic approach encompassing truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees for non-repetition. And so this article overall underscores the significance of adopting a comprehensive approach that intertwines legal mechanisms with sincere efforts to acknowledge the suffering of victims and their families. And so by advocating for this approach, she elucidates the intrinsic connection between justice and peace, emphasizing that addressing enforced disappearances is a crucial aspect of achieving both justice and peace in post-conflict societies. And so I think what this also serves is a reminder that uncovering the fate of the disappeared is not just a legal obligation, but sort of a moral imperative that is essential for fostering sustainable peace and upholding human rights. And so what I think this article demonstrates is how through justice we can foster peace by giving justice to those family members who have been affected by conflict. For my third library entry, I chose Argentinian Transitional Justice Processes, Women Behind, and I chose this specifically because it shows the limits of transitional justice processes, and it's also linked to Argentina, which is where I'm from, and I thought it was especially relevant because a few days ago, on Sunday the 24th of March, it was the day of remembrance for truth and justice from the military dictatorship. So this article delves into the intricate intersection of gender, justice, and peace within Argentina's transitional justice landscape, illuminating the historical marginalization of women's perspectives in post-conflict justice mechanisms. So the article provides context on the military dictatorship, where people who were perceived ideological opponents of the military were kidnapped and forced to disappear. And one of the groups that were considered opponents of the military were women who deviated from traditional gender norms. And these women were kidnapped and kept in clandestine detention centers where they were tortured. And the author also describes instances of gender-based and sexual violence. The article then goes on to discuss the discrimination that went on during post-conflict transitional justice processes against women, and how despite the persistent advocacy of grassroots women's organizations for accountability and justice, cases involving gender-based and sexual violence were often disregarded and stigmatized during formal legal proceedings. So women who faced this type of violence did not actually ever achieve any sort of justice, and perpetrators were not held accountable for their acts of sexual violence. So the article underscores the detrimental repercussions of excluding women's voices and experiences from transitional justice endeavors. It argues that such exclusion undermines broader objectives of peace, restoration, democracy, and human rights advancements, and it importantly advocates for a more inclusive approach to transitional justice, one that prioritizes the narratives of those historically marginalized from the dialogue. So ultimately, this paper provokes critical reflection on whose justice really takes precedence and what conception of peace is pursued within justice mechanisms. So by challenging existing paradigms and advocating for inclusivity, it aims to break the cycle of impunity and injustice, ensuring that women's rights to justice are upheld and their voices heard in the pursuit of lasting peace and reconciliation. I think that it challenges to confront the inherent shortcomings of a justice system and to look for other methods of ensuring that people's voices are heard and that their justice is reached. And this necessitates a reevaluation of existing legal frameworks and the exploration of alternative methodologies to address systemic inequities and broaden access to justice for all, which leads me to my other articles, which sort of bring out the themes of how other subjects and expertise can be used to enhance justice mechanisms and make sure that everybody's voices are heard. So introducing this idea is my third library entry called How Do We Talk About Truth in South Africa, which was a podcast. And it was an interview about a South African journalist and poet that was renowned for her coverage of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And basically, she talks about her personal involvement and documented the TRC hearings, shedding light on the impact experienced by both victims and journalists alike. Notably, what emerges as a theme is the power of literature as a tool in navigating the complexities of the TRC. And she basically discusses how she used poetry and fiction, specifically in her book Country of My Skull, to intertwine together the factual and fictional elements of the process to offer a more nuanced understanding of the truth that transcends the constraints of conventional journalism and the justice process itself. She really underscores the importance of acknowledging diverse perspectives, recognizing that each individual's truth holds validity based on their unique experiences. And as the discussion unfolds, she examines the relationship between truth and reconciliation, challenging the notion that truth alone guarantees reconciliation and that the justice process did that. She especially expresses her reservations about the efficacy of truth commissions, since there's the potential for these mechanisms to become mere symbolic gestures devoid of any actual substantive justice. So ultimately, this podcast prompts a reflection on the limitations of truth commissions and advocates for more comprehensive approaches to addressing historical injustices. And it does this through looking at the arts and how the arts can be used as well to tell a wider truth that perhaps cannot be achieved through official mechanisms. And I think when reading this, I linked to what we learned during week 6 about the intersection of transitional justice and the arts, and how we discovered the transitional power of artistic expression in conveying truths and fostering empathy, further highlighting sort of the value of multidisciplinary approaches in navigating conflict resolution. And this also reflects to what we have been doing now with the theater group and also the musicians in trying to use the arts to promote peace. So this leads me to my final entry. So this is my last library entry, which I think is a good conclusion for all the takeaways that I've had from all the other work and what we've been learning through class. So basically, it's about the transformative potential of the arts, particularly theater and post-conflict reconciliation. And it looks at the collaboration between Peru's Truth and Reconciliation Commission and an indigenous theater group. So it gives context on Peru's tumultuous history, specifically the armed conflict from the 1980s to the 2000s, and the formation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and how one of the things that this commission found was the systematic targeting of indigenous communities during the conflict and the unproportional effect that it had on indigenous communities. So central to this article is the role of theater in engaging the Peruvian community in the reconciliation process, and how this theater group had performances like, for example, Untitled and Rosa Cuchillo, which wove together archetypal characters and symbolic narratives to depict the trauma and injustices endured by Peruvian society, particularly by indigenous groups. So by bringing theater to public spaces and fostering audience participation, the theater group facilitated collective reflection on Peru's painful past, while also envisioning pathways for healing and justice. And these performances served as platforms for storytelling and dialogue, especially amplifying voices that would otherwise remain unheard in a normally traditional justice process, and fostering a sense of solidarity and shared responsibility among the people watching the show, and the actors. And so that was bridging sort of the indigenous community as well with the hegemonic non-indigenous population in Peru. So ultimately, the article really underscores the transformative power of artistic interventions in complementing traditional justice mechanisms, offering novel avenues for truth-telling, memory preservation, and societal transformation. So it argues that by harnessing the emotive and evocative nature of the arts, communities can navigate complex conflict narratives and progress towards a more peaceful future. I think this article serves as a compelling addition to the library because it really shows how the importance of adopting a holistic approach to post-conflict reconciliation, one that integrates creative expression like theater alongside traditional justice mechanisms, which is how my thought process has evolved and how I see justice in post-conflict societies looking like. So the emphasis on group interaction and the emphasis on group interaction and contact, which has links in psychology, and how that is also essential to foster empathy and to lead to reconciliation and truth-seeking, and then overall just a more just and peaceful society. And so I also wanted to link this to one of my museum entries called Redefining Andean Women in Peruvian Art and Activism, and it really shows the power of indigenous voices as agents of change. So I had the opportunity to speak to an indigenous Peruvian artist called Violeta Quispe, and she sheds light on the hidden struggles of women in addressing issues of discrimination and gender violence, while also honoring her cultural heritage. In her artwork, she challenges traditional norms, reinterpreting symbols that are traditionally associated with an art form that is purely male. And she sort of reverts that to make it also a female art form. And her paintings are rich with symbolism, advocating for peace, justice, and gender equality amidst societal constraints. So by choosing to work within a traditionally male art form and making it into a female art form, she sends a powerful message about gender equality and inclusivity in the artistic sphere. It just sort of telling women to take charge of their agency. And I think it really demonstrates how the arts can be used as a way of peaceful protest, and how the arts are used as a way of telling truths and telling stories that perhaps are not told otherwise. So, then did I find a solution to reach sustainable peace? Is it the solution to just involve the arts into all the formal legal processes? I think it would be quite naive of me to say that this is it, this is how it should be done, because not all artistic expression can contribute to greater justice and less violence. In fact, creative initiatives also have multiple limitations and have the power to reinforce power inequities, re-traumatize communities, perpetuate harmful stereotypes, trivialize suffering, and demean just sacred cultural forms. So it's very important to also look at these limitations and not just assume that all the arts are just going to have a positive impact for peace. For example, as we also learned in class, music, while it can be used as a way to form communities, it has also been used as a form of torture during conflict. So it's important to look at the duality of all these mechanisms and how everything has their own strengths and their own limitations. And so to use the arts is very important to just have a sensitivity to the issues that it's addressing, because inappropriate approaches can render cultural contributions actually counterproductive. So in general, peace building is not just a linear process. It's a complex mix of various strategies and approaches, and achieving sustainable peace demands a multifaceted approach that addresses the root causes and incorporates diverse perspectives in a way that is respectful and that is sensitive. So when we navigate the realm of art and even justice and peace building, we require a delicate balance of sensitivity and respect for the complexities inherent in conflict resolution. So to conclude, I'm just going to give an overview of my learning journey. This is just a reminder of my initial perceptions of peace and now how they have changed and the key takeaways that I've gotten from this class and from investigating peace and justice. So firstly, I've expanded my definition of what peace is and what peace looks like. It's not just the lack of violence, and it's much more complex than that. I've also learned about how peace is a dynamic and complicated process that requires input from everyone, not just top-down institutions, and how important actually grassroots movements are to peace-building efforts. I've also learned how important diverse perspectives and collaborative efforts from various disciplines to contribute to peace are, and how we all have insights that could be useful for peace-building strategies, and that we should really listen to and collaborate with each other to effectively address issues, conflict, and build a society that is more peaceful. And then finally, I've also learned that peace is not promised and that it is an ongoing and flawed process, and that peace for one person might not be peace for another. So we should not just have this idealistic view that peace is reached and everyone's happy, because that is not always the case. And it is very much an ongoing process, and it will probably most likely forever be an ongoing process. Thank you, and here are my references.